Rain hammered Brooklyn's streets, cold blue neon bleeding from a deli sign into the slick asphalt. Michael Russo stepped out of a black sedan, coat collar turned high, breath ghosting in the frigid night. A door slammed. One shot cracked the air. Michael's boots splashed through gutter water as he fell to his knees beside Vincent Vinny DeLuca, 28, lifeless, blood pooling like a dark mirror. His trembling hands clutched Vinny's crucifix. Somewhere behind him a woman screamed. Distant traffic hummed. Michael whispered, "Who did this, brother?" His jaw clenched. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, but no one ran toward them. Only shadows moved, watching. He shoved the crucifix into his pocket, eyes scanning the dark. A man in a gray trench coat stepped from the corner, face hidden under a tilted fedora. No words, just a slow shake of the head. Michael's pulse roared in his ears. He understood. This wasn't random. It was a message. The funeral smelled of lilies and damp wool. Michael stood near the back, black suit crisp, hair slick, eyes hidden behind dark lenses. Every handshake was stiff, every hug staged for show. Father Angelo's voice carried, warm but rehearsed, calling Vinny a pillar of loyalty in a city that devoured its own. Michael felt the words poison his blood. The boss, Anthony Moretti, stepped to the podium, 60, tall, silver hair, flawless smile, speaking of brotherhood while his eyes cut like razors. As the last prayer ended, Anthony's hand clamped on Michael's shoulder. "Midnight, my club," he murmured, sliding a folded note into his palm. The weight of it felt heavier than any bullet. Michael didn't look at it, not yet. He just watched Anthony walk away, applause hollow in the cold air. That night, the club pulsed with low jazz and whiskey breath. Michael sat in the far booth, shadows folding around him, glass untouched. The note lay flat on the table. "Meet me. Alone." Anthony arrived with two men, both broad, both silent. His smile was all charm. "You've been quiet," Anthony said, sliding into the seat opposite. Michael replied, "Just listening." The boss leaned in, voice low. "You've lost a brother. I've lost a soldier. We both want the same thing." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Do we?" Anthony's gaze lingered, then he tapped the table twice, a signal Michael recognized. Something was already in motion, and Michael was either in or marked. In the alley behind the club, rain still fell, thinner now, just enough to make the brick walls glisten. A figure approached, Elena Vargas, 29, Puerto Rican American, long dark hair under a rain hood, eyes sharp with secrets. She lit a cigarette, the flame briefly revealing her smirk. "You're being watched," she said. Michael leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "By who?" She exhaled smoke into the damp air. "By everyone who wants you dead, which is most of them." Her tone was half warning, half challenge. Michael asked, "And you?" Elena's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm here to make sure you're still breathing when the truth comes out." Michael's apartment was dark, except for the glow of the city beyond the window. He sat at his desk, the crucifix lying before him, its chain curled like a snake. The folded note from Anthony lay open now. Words burned into his mind. "Loyalty is silence." He poured whiskey into a glass, hand steady, eyes fixed on the crucifix. "Not this time," he muttered. A shadow moved outside the door. He reached for the revolver in the desk drawer, slow and silent. The knob rattled once, then stopped. Michael waited, breath measured, heart hammering. Whoever it was had decided not to come in, not yet. Morning crept over Red Hook like a bruise, and Michael sifted through Vinny's burner phones at his kitchen table. The crucifix lay beside the SIM cards, like a tiny verdict. He found 3 numbers that repeated, each tied to cash pickups near the piers. Detective Jack Malloy knocked once, and let himself in, rain on his coat, and a grin that never reached his eyes. Jack Malloy said, "You want answers, you deal with devils." Michael kept his voice flat. Michael Russo said, "Name the price." Jack set an evidence bag on the table, a shell casing sealed, and labeled with care he never used on civilians. Jack Malloy said, "Your boss moved heroin through a church pantry. I can prove it if I live that long." Michael felt the floor tilt, memory of Anthony's eulogy scraping his nerves. Michael Russo said, "You live if I say you do." Jack laughed softly and pointed at the crucifix. Jack Malloy said, "Faith is expensive. So am I." The church pantry smelled of bleach and stale bread, its shelves neat, its secrets neater. Michael moved with a janitor's keys and a thief's silence. Behind flour sacks he found a false wall, then a ledger wrapped in brown paper. Elena slipped in from the alley, hood drawn, eyes wary. Elena Vargas said, "You should not be here without me." Michael opened the ledger and saw dates, weights, initials he knew too well. Michael Russo said, "Anthony's choir sings in kilos." Elena's jaw tightened as she traced an entry marked with Vinny's initials. Elena Vargas said, "He knew, and that is why he died." A floorboard creaked, and both reached for hidden steel. Footsteps stopped outside the pantry door, then retreated. Michael closed the ledger like a confession. Michael Russo said, "Midnight at the club was never a meeting. It was a leash." They met Jack under the BQ where trucks roared like distant thunder. The detective smoked and studied the ledger, lips pursed, eyes calculating margins and bodies. Jack Malloy said, "These codes point to a shipment tonight, Pier 30. Michael watched oil shimmer on puddles that mirrored crooked rebar. Michael Russo said, "You coming or selling this to someone louder?" Jack flicked ash and shrugged. Jack Malloy said, "Both is my brand." Elena stepped closer, voice low and sharp. Elena Vargas said, "If you cross him, I will end you before the tide turns." Jack's grin thinned, but he nodded at her steel. Jack Malloy said, "I want 50 grand and Moretti in cuffs or in dirt." Michael's stare held like a blade against a throat. Michael Russo said, "You will get one of those." Night swallowed the pier, and the river wore a skin of wind. Cargo containers stacked like mute jurors faced the water. Michael watched men unload crates, mocked as kitchen supplies. He counted steps, lights, and exits, the way boxers count breaths. Anthony arrived in a navy overcoat, surrounded by two heavies who moved like wolves on leashes. Anthony Moretti said, "You always did love fresh air, kid." Michael stepped from shadow, hands visible, eyes not. Michael Russo said, "I loved my brother more." Anthony smiled as if told a good joke. Anthony Moretti said, "Vinny forgot silence is the rent we pay to live." Jack shifted near a forklift, pistol hidden under a newspaper. Elena ghosted across the catwalk, her silhouette, a threat the wind could not carry away. The crates opened and the smell of solvent rose, sharp as accusation. Bundles lay wrapped in plastic beside stacks of canned tomatoes. Anthony spread his hands like a benevolent host. Anthony Moretti said, "Charity feeds the poor. Business feeds the city." Michael's voice was low enough to be a prayer. Michael Russo said, "You fed Vinny to the river." Anthony's eyes chilled, then warmed with false pity. Anthony Moretti said, "He wanted to sing. I do not allow hymns." Jack stepped out, badge in one hand, gun in the other, torn between paycheck and conscience. Jack Malloy said, "Hands where I can see them." The heavies reached and time narrowed to a breath. Elena cut the power from the catwalk, and the pier fell into hard moonlight. Michael moved first, and the night answered. The pier fight ended in fragments, shouts, fists, splintered wood, and gunfire swallowed by wind. Michael dragged Elena into the shadows, her lips split, jacket torn. Michael Russo said, "We move now before the tide turns." Jack was gone, his loyalty measured in footsteps leading to darkness. Sirens wailed closer, their blue wash flashing against steel. Elena pressed the ledger into Michael's chest. Elena Vargas said, "This is worth more than either of us. Do not waste it." Michael scanned the crates one last time, committing faces and positions to memory. In the distance, Anthony was already in a car, headlights slicing the fog. Michael knew the next move, not to run, but to follow. His pulse was steady now, the anger sharpened into a blade. They trailed Anthony's convoy into Manhattan. The skyline, a jagged crown of light. Michael drove without a word, every turn precise. Elena's fingers tapped against the ledger, impatience measured in seconds. Elena Vargas said, "He's going to ground, we lose him in 5 blocks." Michael Russo said, "Then we cut him off in 3. They slid into a narrow street, lined with shuttered storefronts. The convoy slowed at a red light, the lead car blocking the escape. Michael parked half a block ahead, engines still running. He stepped out into the cold air, adjusting his coat like armor. Elena's voice followed him, low but urgent. Elena Vargas said, "If you walk up there, you walk into the lion's mouth." Michael didn't turn back. Michael Russo said, "I am bringing teeth." Michael reached Anthony's car before the light changed. The rear window lowered, revealing Anthony with his usual calm. Anthony Moretti said, "You have the look of a man who thinks he can change the ending." Michael Russo said, "I can rewrite it." Anthony chuckled, voice warm as poison. Anthony Moretti said, "Every story I tell ends the same way, with me still breathing." Michael leaned in closer, rain dripping from his hair. Michael Russo said, "Breathing's a habit you might lose." The light turned green, and Anthony's driver pressed the gas, but Michael's hand stayed on the door until the car jerked away, tires hissing on the wet road. The moment wasn't victory, it was declaration. They regrouped in Elena's apartment, a cramped 4th-floor walk-up smelling faintly of coffee and gun oil. Maps covered the table, pins marking supply routes. Elena poured whiskey, her hand steady despite the swelling at her jaw. Elena Vargas said, "Malloy has the other half of the ledger. Without it, this is noise." Michael nodded, eyes on a pinned Polaroid of Anthony's lieutenants. Michael Russo said, "Then we find him before they do." The hum of a passing train shook the glass in the window. Elena leaned over the table, close enough to share the same breath. Elena Vargas said, "You're chasing ghosts, Michael." He looked up, and for the first time that night, his expression softened. Michael Russo said, "Some ghosts need burying." Jack sat in a corner booth at O'Malley's, the kind of bar where secrets drowned easy. Michael slid in opposite him, ledger on the seat beside him. Jack Malloy said, "Half a book won't buy you the endgame." Michael Russo said, "Then give me the rest." Jack's smirk was thin. Jack Malloy said, "Moretti's boys are hunting me. I sell you the pages, I lose my head." Michael leaned in, voice low and cold. Michael Russo said, "Lose it to me or to them, you choose." Jack's eyes flicked to the door, then back to Michael. Jack Malloy said, "Meet me at the bridge tomorrow night. Alone." Michael knew better than to trust him, but the deal was already struck in silence. The Manhattan Bridge wore a crown of fog and sodium light, and the river below whispered like a threat. Michael waited at midspan, coat cinched, palms empty but not harmless. Jack approached from the gloom, hat low, a paper envelope, held like a truce. Jack Malloy said, "Pages you want, price you hate." Michael studied his eyes and saw 2 exits, and neither was mercy. Michael Russo said, "You brought company." Tires hissed in the distance as a dark sedan rolled to a stop with its lights killed. Jack's jaw ticked hard. Jack Malloy said, "I had no choice." Michael's voice fell to ice. Michael Russo said, "You always have a choice, you just charge for it." The doors opened, and men in dark coats spilled onto the walkway like a shadow splitting. From the bridge tower, a red dot floated on Michael's chest, and then slid away as if reconsidering. Michael exhaled and stepped toward Jack, not to shake his hand, but to take his fate back. The first gun lifted, and Michael moved, driving Jack into the guardrail as a round cracked open the fog. Elena emerged from a maintenance ladder, hair damp, pistol steady. Elena Vargas said, "Next one drops if anyone breathes wrong." The gunman stalled, calculating the cost of courage. Jack wheezed and shoved the envelope into Michael's pocket. Jack Malloy said, "I sold you out to buy time, not a grave." Michael Russo said, You keep mixing those up. Sirens grew from the city like a rising argument. The sedan peeled away, leaving 2 men to fate and a boss to distance. Elena hooked her arm through Michael's and tugged him toward the ladder. Elena Vargas said, "We live now and fight later." Michael nodded once, because later had finally arrived. He dropped into the iron ribs of the bridge, carrying pages that cut like razors. They hid in a shuttered boxing gym that smelled of chalk and history. Michael spread the fresh pages against the ring apron, aligning numbers with the ledger's broken spine. The codes sang a cruel hymn to pantry roots, judges on retainer, and union bosses on strings. Elena traced one column and stopped at a name she had erased once before. Elena Vargas said, "I kept books for him when I was 19. I left the day Vinny asked me to help him run." Michael's stare hardened and then faltered. Michael Russo said, "He planned to expose Anthony and pay our way out." Elena nodded like a mourner. Elena Vargas said, "Malloy promised protection, but he promised it to Anthony first." The old ring creaked as if a ghost took a step. Michael touched the crucifix and felt its edges cut. Michael Russo said, "Vinny died because loyalty could not speak." By dawn a plan stood like scaffolding around a condemned truth. Michael would ghost a shipment on the ledger's route, bait for Anthony, and a gallows for Jack I. Elena folded maps into a code only they could read. Elena Vargas said, "We show them a throat to cut, and cut the knife hand instead." Michael's voice was steady as a metronome. Michael Russo said, "Anthony trusts silence, so we break it in a room he thinks is safe." He dialed a number that slept behind stained glass. Father Angelo answered with grief and caution. Father Angelo said, "The church feeds the hungry, not wars." Michael Russo said, "Tonight it feeds justice." The priest said nothing for a breath that felt like years, then agreed to unlock a door he could not bless. Michael hung up and felt the city lean toward decision. Evening fell like a verdict, and the church basement hummed with refrigerators and secrets. The false wall was open, but the crates were empty by design. Jack arrived first, sweating through his collar, eyes scanning corners for ghosts with badges. Jack Malloy said, "Tell me this buys me a future." Michael Russo said, "It buys you a chance to deserve one." Anthony entered with measured steps, flanked by wolves who smelled of money and metal. Anthony Moretti said, "My pantry, my flock, my rules." Elena stood by the breaker box, shoulders squared, no tremor in her hand. Michael faced Anthony with the crucifix in one palm and a ledger in the other. Michael Russo said, "You ordered the hymn to stop, and you killed the choir boy." Anthony's smile thinned to bone. Anthony Moretti said, "I silence songs. I do not miss beats." The lights trembled as if the night drew breath for a storm. The basement felt smaller with every breath, the hum of the refrigerators replaced by the slow click of safeties disengaging. Anthony's men fanned out, boots scuffing tile. Michael slid the crucifix into his pocket and let the ledger fall open like a verdict. Michael Russo said, "Every name, every shipment, every payoff. It's all here." Anthony's eyes narrowed, but his tone was silk. Anthony Moretti said, "Truth only kills if someone believes it." Elena moved closer to the breaker, her shadow stretching long across the floor. Jack shifted, torn between survival and penance. Michael's jaw tightened. Michael Russo said, "I believe it, and that's enough." The air seemed to thicken, a pause before the inevitable fracture. Somewhere above, a church bell tolled, the sound sliding down the walls like a final warning. Anthony stepped forward, and the wolves followed. Anthony's hand rose, a silent command. One of his men reached inside his coat, but Elena's hand slammed the breaker, plunging the room into darkness. A single emergency light flickered red, painting faces like devils in confession. Michael moved first, knocking the gun aside with a snap of bone and metal. Jack found his own weapon, and for a breath aimed it at Michael, then turned it toward Anthony's other guard. Jack Malloy said, "Not tonight." Anthony's smirk cut through the dark. Anthony Moretti said, You think this ends here? Michael's voice was low even. Michael Russo said, "It ends where you fall." The red light buzzed like a dying heart as the first shot broke the air, close enough to taste the cordite. Gunfire cracked in short bursts, deafening in the low ceiling. The smell of powder and blood clung to the humid air. Michael drove Anthony back toward the open wall, each step a cut in the man's empire. Anthony Moretti said, "You'll be dead by morning." Michael Russo said, "Maybe, but you'll be cold before the sun's up." Elena moved between shadows, covering Michael's flank, her aim unshaking. Jack held the doorway, pinning down the last gunman with measured shots. The ledger lay in the red light, its pages fluttering from the shock waves like a choir gasping in unison. Michael's hand closed around Anthony's lapel, dragging him into the glow. Michael Russo said, "Say his name, say Vinny's name." Anthony's silence was the last confirmation he needed. Anthony shoved Michael back, catching him across the cheek with a wild hook. Michael staggered, tasting copper, but didn't fall. Elena's shot took the last guard through the shoulder, dropping him to his knees. Jack barked, "Move," but stayed rooted, revolver still on Anthony. Michael lunged, slamming Anthony against the concrete, the ledger pressed hard into his chest like a brand. Michael Russo said, "This is your gospel. You wrote it. Now choke on it." Anthony Moretti's smirk twisted into something almost human, fear. Footsteps thundered above, backup was coming, and not the kind wearing badges. Elena's voice was sharp. Elena Vargas said, "We leave or we die here." Michael's breath came hard, but his hands didn't loosen. Michael let go only to grab Anthony's collar and drag him toward the stairs. Jack covered the rear, firing twice into the stairwell to slow the rush below. Elena led the way, every turn mapped in her head. Anthony stumbled, but didn't beg. Anthony Moretti said, "You think killing me changes anything? The streets will just choose another king." Michael's reply was a whisper, sharpened to steel. Michael Russo said, "Then I'll keep killing kings." They burst into the alley, the night air a slap after the heat inside. Rain slicked the cobblestones, neon pooling in the puddles like spilt sin. Tires screeched in the distance. This war had just stepped into open air, and Brooklyn was listening. Night swallowed Brooklyn in slick blacks and bruised blues as they ran the alley maze with Anthony between them. Michael dragged him by the collar, feeling the city's breath on his neck. Elena led with the calm of someone who already memorized every exit. Jack covered the rear with a revolver that sounded heavier than it was. Anthony Moretti said, "You do not own the dark. It belongs to me." Michael Russo said, "Tonight the dark pays rent." Sirens searched the sky, and never found them. They cut through a shuttered fish market, scales glittering like coins on the tiles. Elena Vargas said, 5 blocks to the lockup. Keys are under the meter." Anthony stumbled, but his eyes kept counting ghosts. Michael pushed him onward and swallowed the ache in his jaw. The crucifix bit his palm each time his fist closed. They stashed Anthony in a foreclosed locksmith shop that smelled of brass and old smoke. Dust rose like a curtain when the door latched. Michael bound him to a bolted chair with warehouse tape and a length of chain. Anthony Moretti said, "You bind me like a dog and think the leash is power." Michael Russo said, "Power is choosing when to pull." Jack paced under a dim pendulum bulb, counting shadows that did not belong. Elena laid the ledger on the counter and opened a city map. Elena Vargas said, 2 crews will come, one to kill him, one to steal us." Michael studied the routes and marked a red circle near the river. Michael Russo said, "We move him before dawn and end this where the water keeps secrets." The light swung and time swung with it. The interrogation began without questions. Michael placed the crucifix on Anthony's knee and stepped back. The room listened like a priest refusing absolution. Anthony Moretti said, "You want a confession? Bring a choir." Michael Russo said, "I want roots, names, and the man who pulled the trigger." Anthony smiled with tired arrogance. Anthony Moretti said, You already know it was me that ordered it. Elena's breath wavered once, and then steadied. Elena Vargas said, orders do not bleed, men do. Jack leaned against the counter and watched guilt circle the bulb like a moth. Jack Malloy said, give him a name we can bury before sunrise. Anthony laughed softly and nodded toward the ledger. Anthony Moretti said, your detective knows the choir by heart. Michael felt the floor tilt a fraction and chose not to fall. Silence broke like bad glass when tires hissed outside. Headlights crawled across the frosted window. Elena killed the bulb, and the shop became breath and outlines. Michael lifted Anthony's chair and dragged it across the floor, chains scraping like a warning. Jack checked the back door and swore under his breath. Jack Malloy said 2 cars, maybe 3. They know the lock is broken. Michael Russo said, then we fix it with noise. Elena placed the ledger in a canvas bag and slung it over her shoulder. Elena Vargas said, we take the river streets. No cameras, no parishioners. Anthony laughed once in the dark like a bell that refused to bless. Michael cuffed him to a dolly and cracked the door to the alley. Night leaned in and asked for proof of life. They pushed into rain that fell like a second city. The streets near the docks were empty, except for whispers and gulls. Michael kept the dolly close and his eyes closer. Jack led with his gun low and his guilt lower. Anthony Moretti said, you are writing a legend that ends with your ghost. Michael Russo said, ghosts make good rulers. They never blink. Elena scouted the corners, counting cameras that had already died of neglect. The river's smell grew heavier, as dawn made a promise the sky might not keep. Michael felt the ledger thump against Elena's side with each step. Elena Vargas said, 1 more block, and we own the morning. Tires turned behind them but did not rush. The city seemed to hold its breath and lend it to Michael. The pier waited like a witness who finally learned to speak. The pier at dawn was a sheet of silver steel under a bruised sky. Michael stood at the edge, Anthony bound to a rusted bollard, the East River's breath curling in mist around them. Anthony Moretti said, you think the water forgives? Michael Russo said, water remembers. Elena waited in the shadows, pistol lowered but ready, her gaze locked on the horizon. Jack paced behind them, checking for movement, his eyes too restless to be clean. Michael pulled the crucifix from his pocket, holding it between them. Michael Russo said, this was Vinny's, the last thing he touched. Anthony's smirk faltered, but his silence stayed sharp. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries echoing like verdicts. Michael felt the city exhale, and for the first time, it was his breath that carried the weight. Michael crouched to Anthony's level, the crucifix glinting in the pale light. Michael Russo said, say his name, and I'll give you a cleaner end. Anthony Moretti said, names are just stones. You think throwing one will sink me? Elena stepped forward, voice like flint. Elena Vargas said, you've been sinking since you touched that pantry. Anthony laughed once, a hollow sound, then spat blood into the river's edge. Jack shifted closer, hand brushing his gun, his face unreadable. Michael studied Anthony's eyes for one crack, one sign of human fracture, but found only stone. Michael Russo said, then you'll go under nameless. The tide slapped against the pier, as if it agreed. A black SUV rolled into view at the far end of the pier, tires crunching wet gravel. Michael didn't flinch, but Jack's hand went to his holster. Jack Malloy said, we've got company. Elena moved to cover the approach, her silhouette hard against the pale light. The doors opened, revealing 2 men in suits, no colors, no family markers, just the calm walk of professionals. One carried a case, the other nothing at all. The taller man said, we're here for Moretti, alive. Michael Russo said, you're late. Anthony's smirk returned, faint but poisonous. Anthony Moretti said, even the tide waits for me. Michael rose slowly, the crucifix disappearing back into his pocket. He'd been expecting them. This was his last card to play. Michael stepped forward, blocking their path. Michael Russo said, he's leaving with me. The man with the case stopped, his voice calm. Unknown man said, "You don't get to choose." Jack shifted, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. Elena's voice was low but sharp. Elena Vargas said, "Maybe we do." The pier felt like a wire pulled to snapping. Anthony watched with quiet calculation, every muscle ready to seize an opening. Michael opened his coat, showing the ledger tucked inside. Michael Russo said, "This is the only thing more valuable than him. Trade." The man hesitated, eyes flicking to the case. For the first time the air between them cracked, and it was Michael's move to make. The exchange never happened. Michael turned, grabbed Anthony by the collar, and shoved him into the river. The splash was swallowed by the fog, the ropes dragging him under before the men could react. Elena covered Michael's retreat, firing 2 shots into the pier's edge. Jack took the case in the confusion, vanishing down the pier's opposite side. The suited men cursed, but none went into the water. Michael stood at the edge, watching the ripples smooth over, the crucifix heavy in his palm. The sun broke faintly through the haze, a weak gold against the gray. Michael Russo said, "The city can crown itself. I'm done kneeling." He walked away, the fog swallowing him whole.